Whatever screen you're watching this on, whatever chair you're sitting in, whatever clothes you're wearing, whatever glass is by your side, it almost certainly came to you from far away. And it almost certainly came to you in containers like these and on a ship like this. Because the answer to the question, what travels by sea, is, well, everything. I'm Nat Bullard. On this program, we'll dive into the world of shipping and speak with some of its most prominent executives. But first, a look at just how critical this industry really is.
Shipping accounts for 90% of all trade movement. It literally keeps the global economy afloat. There are 6,000 container vessels on the high seas, but only around 200 of these, the largest class. That might not seem like a lot, but the overall numbers are certainly staggering. This ship can carry more than 15,000 containers. In those, you can transport nearly 56 million pairs of shoes or 746 million bananas. That's one banana for every single person in the whole of Europe, and that's just one ship. This one was built for the immensely profitable Asia-Europe-Asia route from the ports of Korea and Japan, along the Chinese coast, down to Singapore, on past Malaysia, and across the Indian Ocean. Then it's into the Suez Canal, through the Med, then up the Western Atlantic to the hungry consumers of Europe and Scandinavia, and then back again. The cargo could be almost anything, but on the outbound voyage will likely include iPads, smartphones, cars, and clothes from the bustling factories of Asia. On the return journey, it's often upscale goods, chocolate, fine wine, and luxury watches. It's an industry worth trillions of dollars a year, and without it, the world as we know it simply wouldn't exist. No coffee chains, affordable electronics, or gleaming new cars. No cheap clothes, exotic fruits, or children's toys. But even if shipping is vital to our way of life, the industry itself remains largely under the radar. In this hour, we'll get a rare glimpse into this hidden world. We'll be joined by Tim Smith, the North Asia CEO of Maersk, a shipping line whose name is seen in ports everywhere. There's Sverre Prytz, senior executive at BW Maritime, a major owner and operator of gas and oil carriers. He's also the managing director of Green Marine Capital, an investment partnership supported by leading maritime industry participants. Julian Proctor is managing director of Tiger Group Investments, a private investment firm focused on the maritime and energy sectors. And we'll meet Tom Boardley, marine director at Lloyds Register, which works with shipbuilders and ship owners to provide safety and technical advice and expertise. Welcome to Changing Tides, Shipping's Future.
We're here today to talk about one of the most important industries in the world, one of the biggest industries in the world. In fact, actually one of the oldest industries in the world, that's shipping. And actually, Tim, I want to start with you and tell me a bit about why it is that even today, with so many other transport vectors, it's shipping that carries 90% of everything.
Well, as you said, I think it's something that's built up over decades or even centuries. But really, it boils down to the frictional cost of distance, where it's possible to move goods over short distances by land. But if you want to move them over longer distances, really, it has to be by ship. That's the most cost-effective way of doing it. And even though new modes of transport are developed more recently, with fast trains and aircraft, you simply can't move the scale of goods cost-effectively by those modes. So it really has to be shipping for the scale of world trade these days.
But Julian, we have lots of things right here from Hong Kong International Airport that fly from here to the West Coast, but it's still so many things that move by ship. Anything further that you would add on that?
Quite simply, ships are still the most effective form of transport. And if you look at the technological change which has occurred over the last 5 to 7 years, that trend has only accelerated. Shipping for the longest time had been an incredibly sleepy, quiet environment, but we've seen such huge change since 2008, the global financial crisis, which has truly changed the economics.
So you mentioned the global financial crisis is a big inflection point in shipping, but we've got another one, which is the world's most important commodity dropping in price 50% in 6 months. So, Tom, I want you to tell me a bit about how we think about oil in this context, given that ships both carry it and they run on it.
That's right. Well, if we think about the ships that carry oil, certainly the drop in price may affect global demand, which will affect the demand for ships. But also we're seeing people storing oil, perhaps protecting themselves against future price rise. And they're using ships to store oil as well. But I think the more general point is, how will ship owners behave in this new environment? And I think there probably it's a little bit too soon to say. When the oil price went up, people bought more economical ships and they operated their ships at slower speed. So you'd expect the inverse to apply. But these things take time and you won't find an orchestrated response.
But Sverre, you're an investor in shipping technology. So has that 6-month window of oil price falling in half done anything to the way that you look at technology or the way that the other investors that you see think about shipping technologies?
I think technology is still very important, and Julian is absolutely right. There's been a rapid increase in the innovation that you see for the industry. Of course, ship owners are thinking a little bit harder now that they don't get as rapid of a payback on new investments. But the sort of forward-leaning, progressive ship owners, they also realize that fuel is one of the largest components of their cost structure, so it's important. And they also know that low oil price is not going to stay around forever. So you make investments today and you benefit when things turn around again.
The oil price is sort of like what somebody once asked J.P. Morgan what the stock market will do, and he said it will fluctuate. So, Tim, how do you think about this from a fleet planning perspective? You've got how many ships in deployment here in North Asia?
Well, they go all over the world now, but we have about 600 ships in Maersk Line and about 1,000 within our group. So I think, building on what Sverre said, I think we have to take a longer-term view when thinking about the types of ships that we build and operate. Typically, a ship may have an operating life of 20 or 25 years, and as you say, the oil price can go down an awful lot, right, or up an awful lot during the period of the ship's life. But whether the price is high or low, there's still a benefit in having the most efficient ship that you can, the most fuel-efficient ship that you can, so that you can really offer the lowest cost and be able to sort of weather any commercial, competitive challenges that you face.
Tom, you mentioned earlier that you can also use those savings to essentially move a lot faster if you like, right? You can just burn more oil and get there quicker. So let's say that an operator goes that route. Do you think you start to see things shift towards moving by sea as opposed to some other kind of intermodal just because the oil price is low?
Now, I think you find generally that transport mode is relatively inelastic. Ships would have to be a great deal faster before people switch from air freight. I mean, to Europe, air freight is less than a week door to door, and a ship is 3 or 4 weeks. And even if the ship went a little bit quicker, it wouldn't make a great deal of difference. But I think there's another point, and that is that technology isn't just about fuel saving and economy. It's also about environmental protection. And there is an increasing amount of regulation coming in, both in terms of emissions and the sort of fuel that can be used. And therefore, the technology race will not stop. The focus may be retrained more on some of these abatement technologies as opposed to fuel-saving technologies, but the technology demand will not slow down.
Does that sit right with you?
Absolutely. I think Tom's hit the nail on the head. I think we will always have, as I said a minute ago, this desire to make our ships as efficient as they can, as economic as they can. But with this sort of cloud of regulation that's going to hit the industry in the next 10, 15 years, we're increasingly looking at how do we invest for ships which can be compliant with emissions reduction technology, emissions reductions control, and so on, in many jurisdictions around the world.
Still ahead, mega ships, high-tech new fuels, and an old-school twist. State-of-the-art technology in today's marine world.
Sverre, I want to start with you. Technology with a capital T, right? We've alluded a little bit to it already, and it's going to be a thread that runs throughout this. But tell us, if you can, your perspective, and in layman's terms, right, what's the state of the art when we think about technology involved in the shipping industry today?
Well, to be blunt, shipping is still a bit behind. Okay. It's a very conservative industry, as you know, and the challenge is that, to get that adoption, you have to get more than just a few ship owners to buy into things. And but I'm happy to see that things are accelerating, and you do see things that are quite innovative in the industry. Ship owners are now starting thinking using batteries for ships, for example, as a mode of propulsion. It's something completely unheard of, 5 years ago.
How about software? Anything in that sector that you play with?
Yeah, it's software is also important. It's as you think about really refining the amount of fuel that you use, having the right software package and the information gathering on the ship. It's a massive amount of different systems that all feeding into the central database. A lot of times that data is not used as effectively as you can. By putting software packages on top of that really optimizes your weather routing, your trim, the speed of the different engines and so on, you can have quite a lot of savings on a modern ship.
Maybe I could come in there, because I think we certainly see as an operator now that the age of big data is coming to shipping as well. And there's a raft of information on all those things that Sverre was talking about to do with the way that the ship's operated, which we now use. We send as close as we can real time to a central control center, which monitors all of our ships globally, and they send very specific instructions now to the masters to slow down half a knot or to adjust some of the settings on the engine or equipment. We have refrigerating containers on board. We can see all of the settings for all of those containers 24/7 all around the world and make adjustments to them as well. So this is good for fuel saving. It's also good for safety and for efficiency.
Julian, I'm sure you're doing similar. You're doing other deployments. But where are you seeing most opportunity then, from your perspective?
It's interesting because we're trying to learn from other industries. So how have other industries utilized technology in an applied way? What can we learn from that? I'll give you one example. We are a large investor in a yacht-making business. And it's a particular part of the yacht-making business because they make very high-end racing yachts. Now, can we learn from the materials that they use in making these very high-end racing yachts, and can we utilize that on commercial ships? So you can imagine pontoon covers, you can imagine ferries, offshore supply vessels. There's so many different ways which we haven't even thought about. We haven't scratched the surface yet.
Tom, do you think that we're going to see some of these, should we say, less forward-looking people in the industry viewing new technology as nothing but a risk, right? Or a very difficult balance between upside and downside?
Yeah, well, I'm always very careful how I describe people in the industry because they're all our clients, whether they're allegedly backward or forward. I think what I would say about the shipping industry is I think it generates more wealth for the individuals than almost any other industry. And it's also probably the freest of free markets, very little subsidy. And therefore, I think a majority of owners take a very cold, hard look at anything they're being offered, decide whether they're going to put it on their ship or not. Having said that, there is an increasing sort of awareness that some of this technology will come and will benefit those. The other thing is that when you phone the help desk, it's only available in the next port. And what we're finding at the moment is that it's more important that we train ship's crew onto how to operate the things that allegedly have software for when the software stops working, because there is no one to turn to. You have to find the solution yourself. So I think people are looking for reliable, dependable technology.
Sverre, how much does this sort of help desk aspect play into what you're looking at? It's
very important. In fact, we have sort of dismissed a number of potential investments because it simply was too complicated. You have these vessels operating in the Pacific middle of Atlantic, far away from the help desk or any sort of help, and you really need to have it be simple enough so the relatively small crew of 20, 30 people are able to operate this and deal with everything on board. So simplicity of operation is very important. But that being said, I think you just have to, be a little bit more progressive in trying and find ways around these issues. The industry sort of standard approach has been, no, that's too complicated, we'll wait and see if someone else does it. But I do see a shift that you don't have to have it be so simple that you can fix it with a hammer, as the way it used to be in the past.
Are you still looking to fix things with hammers, Tim?
I think it's changed a lot. I think the industry's changed a lot. Probably, I mean, you alluded earlier, we've got a long history. Maybe in some eyes we are seen as dinosaurs, but I think that there's a lot of new technology, a lot of innovation within the shipping area. And let's not forget, we are still running a very, very efficient operation here. I mean, in real terms, the cost of bringing a pair of sneakers from China to Europe is about 35 euro cents. I mean, it's very, very cost effective what the shipping industry does for the world. So I think we actually have got a history of having done many of the right things, choosing the right technologies and the right systems and processes. Probably that trend is accelerating now, and we need to spend more time on looking at R&D and innovation, how we practically apply those learnings. But I think we've got a good platform to build on, and probably we'll still need the hammer, but we also need technical specialists and so on to balance that out for the future.
Julian, tell me what you'd love to see coming your way. What do you want one of Sverre's portfolio companies to bring to you to say this is the best thing we've got going?
Well, I guess it's what we don't want him to bring is the teleporter where he puts us all out of business.
We'll get to that later, actually. I'm going to talk about. I have a question.
That's what we don't want. I think some of the more exciting areas surrounding shipping relate to new forms of technology which will be so transformative. Do we see a move back to wind panels? So there was a wonderful article in one of the papers recently where you had a ship which had a very large sail. Yeah. And could we imagine those types of possibilities? And the answer is possibly yes. So over the next 20, 30 years, could we see a paradigm shift in vessels away from how they've looked for the last 80, 90 years to something which looks really quite different than today? That's what I would like to see.
Up next, still burning heavy fuel, but change is coming. The shipping industry's efforts to go green and why more needs to be done.
I want us to talk a little bit about the corporate social responsibility side of this sector, because this is something that is emerging recently, but has a potentially profound set of implications for the industry. So, Tom, I'd like to start with you and sort of lay of the land, where CSR plays into today's thinking on investment and how it plays as well in the financial markets.
Yeah, I think shipping struggles a little bit with corporate social responsibility. I think on the one hand, I can't think of a ship owner that doesn't want to do a good job, be a good member of the community, be environmentally friendly. I'm afraid the industry does let itself down a little bit. It's a highly visible industry, and then therefore when anything goes wrong, the assets are there for everybody to see. And I think also some of the reluctance to accept some of the environmental regulation is construed as being anti the environment, whereas I think what people actually want is environmental regulation that will work in the context of the maritime business.
So, Tim, how do we keep it front of mind then?
I think there are a few things that will help to make that happen. I mean, I think first of them is that for our customers, these are issues which are increasingly important. A lot of our customers, at least, are large multinational corporations. They have their own responsibilities and obligations. Increasingly, corporates have to make available data on their performance in many areas of corporate social responsibility, particularly as related to the environment. And I think those customers are expecting more from their shipping industry suppliers.
I think this is extremely important that it's become a demand-pull situation, wherein the people who are going to be shipping $1 billion worth of goods with you every quarter say, What did they say? Did they say you must do this, or we'd like it if you do this?
I think maybe the other panelists might speak more about the non-container sector, because I think that this is probably most pronounced, say, in the oil industry, where I think standards are very, very high. But in container shipping, we are seeing that increasingly. Our issue, I guess, more than anything else, is who's going to pay for that compliance? And the customers want us to perform to a higher standard, and we want to perform better. But how do you share the costs and the rewards?
So who does pay for it?
Well, unfortunately, it's been the ship owner who pays, and the
Right.
and the customer has generally seen the benefits. And this has been one of the challenges of split incentives between the capital cost being incurred by the owner and the economic benefits being obtained by the customer.
Is there any role you play in this mix, Sverre, to sort of make sure that is pulled in, that interest?
Well, first of all, it's very critical as us as a technology investor are interacting with all the ship owners. And as a result of that, we've had multiple conversations with ship owners all over the world. And one thing that I think is very positive is throughout those conversations, we've seen that this generation of ship owners, which, as Julian says, are mostly private enterprise or families, we've seen a very positive shift in the direction of, okay, we know we have a corporate or social responsibility to be good citizens.
Tom, do you agree with that? I mean, is there a dynastic legacy play here in doing things that are also within the mantle of corporate social responsibility?
Yes, and I think as Julian and Tim said earlier, a lot of the clients of those shipping companies are major corporates, be they the oil majors or some of the major commodity shippers. And they can't tolerate the association with an industry that has a problem. Certainly the tanker industry has seen a huge reduction, and I hope that continues in oil spills. And I think it's everyone's wish that shipping basically stays off the front pages for the right reasons.
Bloomberg Business Week actually had a Maersk Triple-E on the cover of our magazine about a year and a half ago. So what are the things that you want to have on that cover? What are the things you want to have on the front page?
Yeah, I think as Tom says, these are the good stories. I think when we're talking about how we are helping to generate wealth for the world's economy, we're helping to lift populations out of poverty. I think if you look at the situation in China, I think shipping has arguably played a very good contributory role to China's economic development and lifted, I don't know how many 100 million people above the poverty line in the last 20 years.
Sverre, in your portfolio, though, you've got some specific things. If you wanted to point to one and say, these are the things that will tip the needle. These are the things that will make us more responsible as actors in the sector, and also, as Tim pointed out very well, bring continued welfare to people in the world.
Right. No, I give you two examples. One is we have an investment in a ballast water treatment system company.
Okay.
It's called Ocean Saver. And it basically helps you treat the ballast water. So when you move ballast water from one water to another part of the world, you avoid the contamination with various invasive species and so on. Another one is we're working with a company called Corvus, which is a battery company. Mm-hmm. Basically creates the Tesla of the seas. Yep. So you can, and it's fascinating because it is not a decision, and this comes back to doing the right thing and making money at the same time. It is actually a very rapid payback by putting battery systems on your ships.
In a moment, from China's new Silk Road to the fabled Northwest Passage, we'll look at new trade routes on the map and what they mean for our and shipping's future.
We're talking about an industry that moves over 90% of global trade. That means almost everything you've ever owned traveled to you by ship. It's an absolutely vital transit network, crisscrossing millions of miles every year.
I want to get down to the physical aspect, and I want to talk about it in terms of actual trade routes. And Julian, I'd like to start with you. What are the physical manifestations of all of these things that we've talked about so far?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You've obviously seen from China the fact that the leadership there is talking about a new Silk Road and how that will reshape a lot of the trade routes of old. So not only the overland Silk Road, but the maritime Silk Road. So will we see sea trade routes go up to Malaysia and then goods transported on trains up into China? All very plausible. So a lot of the rule books or a lot of the rules of thumb we've had from the past, maybe we need to have new ships for these new trade routes. You know, in the past, we built a Panamax bull carrier because that was the longest ship you really wanted to put into Japan, into the ports of Japan, because the price of land in Japan was at such a high premium. So the topography of the land and those trade routes will very much shape the vessels of the future as well.
And Tom, what do you think in terms of these potential new routes? Do you buy this notion that we'll have a new Silk Road?
Well, I think first of all, world trade continues to grow, and we assume that at normal growth rates, we'll need twice as much shipping in the next 20 years as we have now. So the first thing is there's going to be an awful lot more ships required, and therefore it's a growth industry, and then it will remain a growth industry. But in terms of the routes, I think you will see changes. I mean, if you look at the Atlantic, i.e. two mature economies trading with each other versus the Pacific is now much bigger than the Atlantic, whereas 20 or 30 years ago they're about the same size. What we see happening is the area of the Indian Ocean connecting India, China, Africa and Latin America, particularly the east coast of South America, you'll see the explosion of growth. And therefore, in terms of port development, there's going to be a lot in this part of the world and in those developing areas, and probably less so in the mature economies, simply because they're seeing lower growth rates.
So, Tim, how do you, from a fleet perspective, then prepare for that?
It's a really critical decision when you're trying to plan ahead to think about what sort of tonnage you might need for the future. I think building on the input from the last two gentlemen, we've seen for probably 20 years the big growth was as manufacturing was outsourced from Europe and North America to Asia. So long-haul trades from Asia initially to Europe and America, and then filling in to the emerging markets, to Africa, to Latin America and the Middle East. What we think is probably going to happen in the next period of time is we'll see some what we call backhaul. So as China starts to develop, it's going to become an important market in its own right. So there'll be more import business into China, and there'll be more regionalization of trade. So rather than having a small number of very large vessels to go very long distances, we're probably talking about a more fragmented trade, where you perhaps need small and medium-sized vessels with more frequency, or at least a mix of tonnage, which is different from what we've had for the last couple of decades.
Well, in the old days, if you wanted to do a shipment to a port in Africa, it might be ro-ro, right? It might be roll on, roll off.
Absolutely.
But you're also in the situation now, particularly with a lot of construction capabilities coming from here, moving to East and West Africa, that you could build whatever port you want.
Yes.
So what do you think we'll be seeing in the sort of China-Africa or China-Latin America routes? What's going to happen? What's going to be built? Julian, what do you think people will be doing?
Well, I think a large part of this depends on infrastructure. And if we look at the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of infrastructure in Africa. So ports are being built with bigger berths, which allow bigger ships to move into. You're seeing a development of road networks, which we haven't seen in the past as well. That's also occurring in Latin America. So if we forecast forward and we believe that these countries see the same rate of infrastructure growth as in the last 10 to 15 years, we could see a demonstrable change in the types of ships that we need, because it was always a rule that the biggest ship that you could have going to a West African port was a 2,500 or 3,000 TEU ship. That's simply not true anymore. You can get much bigger ships in. So to us, having a view on how infrastructure is spent and where that infrastructure is spent is a key indicator for where we need to invest in the future. What I would also say is, as a follow-on to that, some of the big critical uncertainties that we face, as opposed to the certainties, relate to climate change. How will it affect the northern route, the northern passage? What type of ships will we need? What will that mean for trade between Europe and Asia, or between Asia and certain parts of the Pacific?
So, Sverre, have you got anybody coming to you with this climate change investment thesis and the technologies that they're bringing?
Well, we're trying to avoid climate change. Primarily, it's the objective. But you know, for example, climate change, as Julian has mentioned, it opened up Arctic waters for more transportation. That means that you have to be prepared in terms of technology. You know, if you're going to have ships traveling through the Arctic, you have to think about it very differently than it just normal crossing across the Atlantic, because you need different types of hull coatings, you need different safety procedure. You know, the impact of a mishap in Arctic is very, very, very different than it is in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. So the rigor that you have to apply, and therefore the technology that you have to draw on, needs to increase in order to take advantage of those routes.
And the Arctic in particular is an extraordinary opportunity and challenge from an operational perspective. How about Tom, from how you see it, and what would you say about opportunity in the Arctic for moving cargo?
Well, I think the shipping industry needs to be very careful about how it deals with the Arctic. Our experience so far is that the ice fields have retreated and then they've started coming back again. And whereas most of the oceans of the world are unrestricted and ships of any flag can ply, in the Arctic they're still largely regulated by the nations because the sea lanes are so close to the nations. Some new legislation is coming up in the International Maritime Organization called the Polar Code, and that will restrict the type of ships that can enter that area. It's very, very much needed legislation. I have to say, from a classification society point of view, where we're looking at the type of ships that are going to be ordered, except where perhaps Russia and Canada will want to exploit their resources that come from that area, we are pretty negative about the prospects of large amounts of international tonnage going on those routes. First of all, there will continue to be difficulties. The ships will have to be much stronger to protect them against ice. And when you look at where the world trade growth will take place, it will not be along the Arctic Rim. It will be in warmer climes. So I think it's a very important area. It's a very important area to protect. And I think it's one of these areas where you begin to see much tighter control of shipping than perhaps you've seen in the past.
Tim, have you got a sort of up and over Arctic strategy?
No, I think
North Asia.
I think we're watching the developments with interest, but I think, as Tom said, we don't think this is the biggest driver for our business. I think we've got many more opportunities in trade between Asia and the emerging markets and so on that we need to focus on over the next few years.
Coming up, the environmental impact of today's megaports and the efforts to clean up their act.
We've talked quite a lot about ships at sea, so actually in operations on the high seas. But I think it's extremely important to talk about the port itself, right? And talk about what the local environment means for this industry. So, Tim, I want to start with you because you've got operations all over the world, including quite a lot built up in any given port. What's the state of play right now in terms of dealing with cities that actually are your fundamental hosts?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very key point because I think for a long time population has tended to grow in ports and probably years ago that was not seen to be a bad thing at all, but increasingly now I think populations are concerned about being close to physical activity. You get a lot of movements of goods through the port, a lot of trucks and so on, but you also get quite a lot of emissions. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges for the industry, and that, as you know, is that we use heavy fuel oil, which is quite a toxic substance, and we're burning that fuel oil in proximity to large densities of populations, and that's something that, as an industry, we need to deal with over the course of the next 10 years or so. This has got to be an opportunity, though, from a technology side.
Absolutely. There's, of course, everything that you can do on a ship, but also what you can do in the port. And port is all about efficiency. We want cargo to go in quickly, unload it, reload it, and then move along. So that's where there's both sort of IT solutions. There's also, very sort of, maybe you think about it as sort of simplistic, but, these ships need to be cleaned. They need to be washed. The hulls need to be washed. We now have technology that actually allow you to clean your ship while you're in port. The same time you're doing loading and unloading operation, you can get a cleaning of your hull. Instead of having to spend separate time sitting at anchorage and then doing the cleaning, you can now do it in port. So things like that can really help with the efficiency of the port is important.
Tom, do you think that there's sort of good faith on both sides? How are the cities themselves making sure that they're doing the right things for the industries that are coming to port?
Yeah, I think cities realise that ports are an incredible revenue generator for them. Ports and all their associated activities, be it in transport or in labour, are tremendously productive. But as Julian and Tim alluded to, people don't necessarily want to have their penthouse overlooking a container terminal. And we've seen in some cities around the world, such as Sydney, where to a large degree the port activity has been moved away from the main part of the harbour, pushed away by property prices, which has meant that it's not efficient use of the coastline there. But the other thing is the ports are where shipping is visible. That's where people see ships. And therefore, I think it's really important that ports are seen to be efficient, the ships are seen to be clean and to be working effectively. And then the other aspect, which is very much a sort of the social dimension, is obviously the labour and how they're working. And what we're seeing at the moment, certainly on the US, on the West Coast, is that you begin to understand how critical the ports are to a nation's prosperity. If the port workers stop working or don't work as efficiently as they should, there are profound knock-on effects for the whole economy. And that's when the world realises that 90% of what they buy is shipped by sea.
So, Julian, a city says to me, I want you to move your port, and I would imagine you say back to them, are you paying for it? How do you finance this? Let's say that you actually do want a city to move its port operations to somewhere else.
Well, I think it depends, what port you're talking to.
Sure.
And obviously, ports talk in different languages. If you talk to a Chinese port, then the government probably says that's absolutely possible and we will finance it and we will move it. Right. So I think it depends geographically where you're having that discussion. If you're in the United States, however, even raising the issue of trying to move a port is political suicide, so very hard to do. So I think even if with the greatest will of large amounts of private capital, it would be very difficult to address port infrastructure issues in developed economies, simply because the regulatory considerations and the environmental considerations are so substantial. I think there's much greater opportunity in places like India and China. India is right at the beginning of its infrastructure journey. So as you look at the build-out of ports, and there's many ports being built in India, there is the opportunity to address this issue. And it'll be a mixture of private as well as public funding, I suspect. There's obviously not as deep a public purse as in China. For China, it's probably very different. Yep. Still state capitalism, large pockets of public funding are available. So there's greater abilities to move ports from Hong Kong to Shenzhen. Right, yeah? And Shenzhen's been growing at a faster clip than Hong Kong has been for the last few years. So we may see that trend continue. So we may have a new port automatically in Shenzhen.
That's right. So, Tom, if you're going to speak to a city that wants to move its port, what would you give as a word of advice? Sort of friendly reminders, or perhaps points of issue that might come up if you're going to be doing this?
Yeah, I think as long as the city's prepared to put its hand in its pocket, as Julian said, what we've seen in China with places such as Qingdao, which went from a port with maybe less than 1 million TEU a year, a new greenfield site. A few years later, it was exporting 10 million TEU a year. Now, China clearly understood the need to develop its port infrastructure, and that has helped propel double-digit trade growth year after year after year. I think in other areas it's much more difficult. I think of Vancouver, for instance, which has developed a port outside the city. But actually there's a great deal of affection for having a port in the city, and therefore you continue to have the city terminals, which have a degree of environmental impact, but not huge. But it generates interest, it generates movement, and I think a lot of people don't want to think that their port is going to die if they shift most of the activity away. So I think for city planners, they need to think very carefully about creating some sort of anaesthetic which removes a lot of this physical activity, because they may lose it.
If you move the port completely, then the city's reason to be might have changed in its own very completely. A final quick word. If you've got the 50 words you want to give to a city that's considering doing something like this to move the port, what would you add?
I think I would say think about the total economic cost. You've got to take into account the value of the port for the wealth it brings and the trade that it generates, not just for the port but its whole hinterland, and that obviously needs to be balanced against the needs of the citizens. But you need to get both, and don't let either of them get the dominant hand.
Still to come, automation, miniaturization, and 3D printing. What's next for this 4,000-year-old global industry? That's when Changing Tides returns.
I want to give us a look deep into the future, or at least as deep as we're capable of looking at this moment. And actually, Julian, I'm going to come to you because you talked already about the new Silk Road. So I want to hear about a challenge, an actual physical challenge to this notion of shipping 90% of everything by sea.
Well, currently, I think the largest challenge that we have is the fact that we power our ships with non-renewable resources, and if we forecast ourselves long enough into the future and we don't find a solution for alternative power sources, then this squeeze will become incredibly acute. And the oil price spike that we saw several years ago is just a symptom, one of the symptoms of the scarcity of non-renewable resources. So if I was to think about what is the single largest factor which would keep me awake if I was to look 200 years into the future, it would be the fact that we still power our ships with gas, with crude oil. These are concerns. We have to, it's imperative we find solutions to this. It's by no chance that we didn't have sails for the last several thousand years.
Well, you've already looked at some sails, I'm sure, in some of your portfolio. What else?
No, there's a lot of development in new fuels. There's some ship owners that are even experimenting with biofuels as a complement, at least, to what they're doing. But especially where oil prices are now, this is not going to happen very quickly. So I think you have to think about this in sort of a stepwise progression. It's we switch to LNG. We then switch to more renewables. We then maybe get into more advanced technologies. I don't think that shipping is going to be the first to adopt, but we can maybe learn from others.
Well, Tom, I want to come back to this notion of sending things over land, right? Because we talked that clearly Asia is at the heart of these trade relationships, sending things to the developed economies, in this case particularly Europe. I mean, is it viable? Is it viable that you're going to be shipping things by rail from Western China all the way to Western Europe?
Well, it's certainly viable. And if we go back 10 or 20 years, the Trans-Siberian Railway was a viable alternative for exports from Japan to Europe. I think we keep coming across the fact that as soon as you cross land, you meet government and regulation. And the seas at the moment are totally deregulated. Add to that, as we discussed in the first session, the cost of moving things by land is a lot more than moving things by sea. And I have to say, I'm somewhat skeptical.
What do you say to that?
I think Tom's right. I think a lot of these things are definitely going to should be on our radar screens for the future. I think if you're looking for big changes that could impact us, I think the other thing that we need to think about, Nat, is how changes in demand might evolve. I mean, we've talked about technology change, but digitization, miniaturization, that means potentially in future there's fewer goods to be transported long distances. If you take 3D printing as an opportunity, that may mean there's more local production. And I mentioned already when we were talking a minute ago, we see in our supply chains today a lot of regionalization of trade. So goods manufactured closer to market in order to get there faster because of the very fast nature of many retail markets these days. So all of that could have a big impact on how much demand there is for ships, whether we need so much.
Well, it raises the question, are you going to be shipping more TVs or more thermoplastics to print that TV at the end destination? So
absolutely.
What do you say, Julian? 20 years from now, is that potential digitization, regionalization of any kind of good that could normally be traveling in finished fashion, is that going to happen? And is that going to impact the way you think about your business?
Well, I still tend to believe that the old age tenets of good competitive advantage will still play out. So countries which have lower wages, which are more productive, more competitive, they will continue to be the factories of the world. I don't think we're going to change that paradigm. So will we see Vietnam, India taking over the role of China in 20 to 30 years? Possibly. In fact, if you were to say degrees of certainty, I'll be much more certain about that outcome than certain other outcomes. So I don't think the overall raison d'etre of trade will change. What I do think will certainly evolve will be intra-regional trade, simply because you will have Southeast Asian countries which will be bigger countries. They will have more demand. Right. They will be purchasing from each other. They will be creating supply chains from within the regional network. I think they're more likely outcomes than some less certain, lower probability events. So I would look for greater regionalization of trade, because Southeast Asia and North Asia will be growing faster.
Tim, I think that the industry will be around in one form or another. It is, as we say, the way that things have been moving since the beginning of human civilization. But what's going to be the biggest challenge in the next 50 years?
I think some of the things that we've been talking about, whether there may be some big change in the way that we propel our ships, changes in the nature of the demand for our products, the whole idea that goods may be to some extent replaced, or physical movement of goods may be to some extent replaced by electronic transmission of data and so on. I think these are the things that, if you're really looking at your crystal ball, could be out there. I think what we have to hope is that we have enough time to observe these changes. We can adapt and bring, as we have a long history of doing, as Tom was saying, bring the new technologies into play in a way that doesn't cause any shocks and enables world trade and the world economies to keep moving.
New technologies, new fuels, new ideas. Shipping has encountered and weathered many changes over the centuries, and it will doubtless continue to do so for centuries to come. The vessels may change, but the mission doesn't. The global industry of shipping will deliver the goods and services that a global economy demands. I'm Nat Bullard. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.